Howdy doody folks, and welcome back to my journey across the United States. Today we're going to talk about some of Minnesota's most haunted places, from tall menacing towers in Duluth, where one of my favorite YouTubers, Mav dwells, to islands in the Mississippi River that, despite being right near Minneapolis, have plenty of spirits to call their own. To put it simply, your state is mighty haunted. Now, before we get started, I just want to quickly let you know that if you want to help this channel out, liking, subscribing, and commenting your favorite haunted place will go a long way to helping me go from silver to gold status here on YouTube. Seriously, only like 5 to 30% of my viewers subscribe, and if that number bumped up even a bit, it would help me out a ton. Anyhow, without further ado, let's get into Minnesota's haunted places. Pike Island is an island in the middle of the confluence of the Mississippi and Minnesota River, just outside of Minneapolis and St. Paul. It's an island managed as part of the Fort Snelling State Park, but it has a history that stretches back much further than its time with the park system. To begin, to the Dakota natives of the region, this place is sacred, referred to as Bedote, a word I hopefully pronounced right that in their tongue refers to the place where the two waters come together, with this area generally being considered their place of creation, or where the earth created the first Dakota man and woman. In a way, to translate to a Western audience, though this may not be accurate to native tradition, my impression is that this was their Garden of Eden. Thus, historically, the Dakota set up camps and villages on this island. And, of course, due to its location at the confluence of these two major rivers, it was a strategic location to hunt, fish, and trade. And fishing is still a major activity on this island today from what I can tell. As for the more modern history of this island, though, the island became involved in American expansion and military activities in ways that aren't so glamorous. To begin, in 1805, Zebulon Pike, a U.S. Army officer and explorer, led an expedition up the Mississippi River, passing near this island, which, in honor of his expedition, would eventually be named after him. In 1820, Fort Snelling would be built on the bluffs overlooking this region, bringing a military presence to the area to assert control and enforce U.S. policy towards native tribes. Ultimately, as you might expect, this would indirectly, but also sort of directly, lead to atrocities being committed to the natives here. In 1862, for instance, there was a U.S.-Dakota War. In the summer of 1862, tensions exploded between the Dakota Sioux and the U.S. government in Minnesota after years of broken treaties, delayed payments, and widespread hunger. Promised supplies never came, and corrupt traders refused credit, literally telling starving Dakota to eat grass. Thus, feeling desperate and betrayed, some Dakota warriors attacked white settlements, sparking 6 weeks of violent conflict, in which over 600 settlers and soldiers were killed, along with many Dakota as well. The U.S. military responded with overwhelming force, though, eventually capturing thousands of Dakota people, and after the war, 38 Dakota men were put down in a mass execution, the largest in U.S. history, and over 16 Dakota women, children, and elders were then imprisoned near Fort Snelling in brutal winter conditions, including actually on Pike Island during the winter of 1862 to 1863, where many died. The survivors were exiled, and Minnesota banned all Dakota from the state, marking a grim chapter of forced removal and cultural destruction. That said, as you may expect, when atrocities like this occur, they aren't entirely forgotten, whether it's the guilt felt by those who committed them, or the sad modern memory of what occurred on and around Pike Island. One thing is for certain, they say that at least 130 to 300 people passed here, only to be buried on or around the island in shallow or unmarked graves. And thus, because Pike Island was the site of this, they say the place is mighty haunted. Now, those visiting Pike Island, fishing, biking, and perhaps picnicking or snowshoeing during the winter report odd things throughout the internet. To begin, there are whispers of these odd things going on, with the most common occurrence being strange noises, feeling watched, and seeing people that don't quite have the form you'd expect, and are sometimes just always out of reach. No matter how fast you run, they kind of still stay the same distance from you on the trail. That said, it gets worse. I found a forum where some snowshoers were reporting finding bare footprints in the snow while trekking along Pike Island. and thus they posted about this online on a forum. And while their post was initially made with concern in mind, the other commenters immediately went a different direction, commenting that maybe they might have just found some ethereal evidence that someone, or perhaps something, had been walking these trails before them, and they probably didn't want to run into them. There are also, of course, EVPs heard, often in a tongue not understood by the modern English-speaking population. And sometimes there are also phantom campfires that are seen on the island from the proverbial mainland. Campfires that you see on the island, and if you approach them and go towards them, they will gradually flicker away into the night. Further, Fort Snelling nearby is haunted by these same phenomena, but additionally they see the apparitions of soldiers and Dakota people that are clearly being restricted or imprisoned. Given Pike Island's proximity to this fort, it's easy to see how horrible things that happened at one place might blend into the lore of the other, and that these two places likely add to each other's haunted narratives. In Duluth, Minnesota, today stands one of the state's most haunted places, Nopeming Sanatorium, an old tuberculosis hospital that housed and isolated those with this fatal bacterial infection starting upon its opening in 1912. Nopeming translates from Ojibwe English to in the forest. The facility started as a single building, but it grew rapidly, and by the 1920s, there were 30 buildings on the property that could house over 400 patients. Here, though there was no ill intent behind the many deaths, many passed away, with reports of 220 dying in 1911 alone, a number that decreased over time but was still well over 100 through the 1920s and 1930s every single year. And the patients, as sad as it is, were aware of this, and likely knew from experience that very few individuals with tuberculosis at the time were ever cured. That said, despite this dark undertone, the patients here were treated well. From most accounts I've read, the atmosphere was peaceful, if a bit somber, and while there was a bit of kerfuffle about unreasonable workplace conditions from the staff, there were less complaints about the facility from patients. That said, by the 1970s, TB was pretty much cured, and this location would transition to play another somber role, that of a nursing home, housing many with neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and dementia. Ultimately, though, the facility would go out of code, and St. Louis County lacked the funds to pay for its renovation, and thus the facility closed in 2002, ending its permanent use, with a body count in the thousands during its use. From what I can tell, at this point there are some flimsy plans to use this facility as some sort of home for disabled individuals, or maybe as a shelter for vulnerable groups, but as of now, the building's primary use is as a place where folks tour, and a place that is occasionally rented out for paranormal investigations or films that need an abandoned hospital set. And during these scarce uses today, some report strange run-ins with even stranger characters, leading to a modern reputation as a paranormal hotspot, and a place that, while abandoned, is full of people of another variety. The most well-known supposed haunting here is that of a 9-year-old young girl, who supposedly giggles in the dark recesses of the sanatorium. And this is unique for the channel. See, in this asylum, they apparently keep an old children's tricycle, and they say that many have observed this old tricycle to roll its way down the hallway, despite nobody ever touching it. As for this young woman's name, well, nobody quite knows, and the only accounts I've seen of her origin are essentially psychics spitballing at history that turns out different every time. Regardless, there are other haunted happenings too. Folks don't necessarily report apparitions here like you'd normally see. There's no transparent dude walking down a shadowy corridor in his underpants or shadow person stuff here, but I did find a couple of reports on an old forum that people have observed what appears to be literal lifeless corpses, like the apparitions of hunting ghosts from Phasmophobia, walking between rooms or looking out of windows of the old sanatorium at night, which, in my opinion, is far creepier. The Greyhound Bus Museum is nestled just a short journey away from Duluth, Minnesota, in the quaint town of Hibbing. And funny enough, this was the most notable portion of the first video I ever had that reached 10,000 views, so I thought this museum deserved a recap in this video. And also, a quick thank you to you good people of Minnesota. Now, for a bit of history, Greyhound actually began right here in Hibbing, Minnesota, when Carl Eric Wickman, a Swedish immigrant living here, started running a transportation service. The story goes that Wickman was working in the iron mines, but he lost his job, leading him to look for new opportunities, and thus he started to sell automobiles, specifically a vehicle named the Hupmobile. an admittedly failed automotive brand that at the time was trying to produce affordable cars for the working man and build reliable cars, which, to be clear, hardly existed back then. Carl failed at this too, but at the end of his venture, he did own a Hupmobile. So, being an enterprising individual, he began offering rides to the miners from Hibbing to Alice, Minnesota, and he charged them a fare for this service. And it turned out there was quite a bit of demand for this. Over time, he expanded. He made more routes, he gained more passengers, and eventually, instead of just shuttling miners in a Hupmobile, he started to purchase buses, evolving and merging with other companies, until around 1930, when this little business would rebrand to the Greyhound Corporation. Thus, Hibbing today is recognized as the birthplace of the USA's bus industry, and therefore the Greyhound Museum was founded right here, after local historian and entrepreneur Jean Nicolelli discovered a plaque on a former Greyhound terminal in Hibbing that declared the city as the birthplace of the bus industry. Today, this museum stands, holding many historical buses and plenty of memorabilia relevant to the bus industry, including the actual Hupmobile that began it all. And to be clear, this is a place that T Storytime really extra wants to go to. That said, as you might expect, if you've ever ridden a Greyhound, there is plenty of strangeness surrounding this museum that makes it more than just a tour through an old room full of vehicles. It's a place that many say is haunted. They say that bus windows here creak open, doors of buses mysteriously swing wide open, and objects playfully vanish and reappear. That's what you'll find at this old bus stop, according to many. As for the epicenter of these supernatural occurrences, though, it's none other than the Scenic Cruise 4501, a bus with a spirit that loves to breeze down the highway of eternity with open windows. They say that this bus, while it's usually locked tight, it has a spirit that loves to open its doors for guests, almost inviting them aboard, even though from what I can tell that's not exactly allowed. Therefore, one source I read speculated that this ghost might be that of an old bus driver, inviting aboard people who he perceives to be patrons to go for a long ride on this old bus. And personally, if he invites you aboard, you'd better tell your bus driver thank you. In addition, there's also a tale of a spectral young woman that claims the museum as her eerie abode. I stumbled upon one chilling account of a tourist spotting her amidst mannequins, frozen like a statue. According to this encounter, she then turned and looked after he took a photo, locked eyes with the unsuspecting visitor, and then vanished into thin air. And, of course, she didn't show up in that photo, or at least she didn't other than missed. Others have said, too, that at times they actually spot her sitting aboard the Scenic Cruise 4501 on one of the seats, as if she's waiting for that ghostly conductor to take her for a ride somewhere she never got to go in life. And it's not just the classic hauntings either. There are also shadowy figures that have been reported roaming through the museum. And while nobody really knows who these might be, the plot thickens a little bit when you discover that a cemetery lies a mere 300 feet from the museum's entrance. Now, this is probably a coincidence, but I'll admit there's a distinct chance that the ghosts in that cemetery are taking some PTO over at the Greyhound Museum. Now, to be clear, from what I can tell, nobody actually passed away in any of the vehicles inside. There weren't any accidents on the property, and there weren't any accidents in these vehicles. And this museum, other than being near a cemetery, it isn't exactly a dark or dangerous place. But given the museum was home to hundreds of pieces of Greyhound-adjacent memorabilia, you can't help but wonder if the memorabilia or 17 historical buses serve as vessels for these apparitions to cling on to, allowing them to linger in our world into the present. Sauk Center, Minnesota is a small but historical town located in central Minnesota, founded in the mid-19th century as settlers were drawn to the fertile land and its strategic position along the Sauk River. Officially incorporated in 1876, the town developed as a hub for agriculture, milling, and trade, benefiting from the arrival of the railroad, which brought increased commerce and connectivity to the region. The town's growth and spirit of hospitality during its formative years laid the groundwork for local landmarks to emerge, perhaps none more enduring or enigmatic than the Palmer House Hotel, built in 1901, which stands today as a historic and reportedly haunted symbol of Sauk Center's evolving identity. The The hotel was built following the Sauk Center House, the town's first hotel, which burnt down in an event that we'll circle back to, and was, upon its completion, noted by the locals to be first class. It was built by Ralph L. Palmer and Christina J. Palmer, who after its completion lived here with their children, Christina's mother, and her brother. At the time, it was the only building in town with electricity, and thus it became a gathering place for locals and for traveling salesmen. Otherwise, as for a 1993 renovation, it's mostly just a hotel, and from what I can tell, you can rent it out today for a pretty reasonable $100 to $200 a night. That said, remember, while the Palmer House itself is pretty rainbows and sunshine in terms of its history, there was a hotel here before that burnt down, and the fire that happened there was a little more hellish flames and half the town dying than, oofed, I suppose we've got to build us a new hotel. Lots of people passed away in this fire, young and old, and they say that because of that, this hotel may as well have been built on a graveyard, and that there are plenty of haunted happenings here. Now, in terms of hauntings, one of the most prolific rooms is named Raymond's Room, named after, well, a man named Raymond. See, back in the day, Raymond was a brothel owner, running it out of the top floor of the hotel, which is interesting to think about. And nowadays, they think that old Raymond, possibly enjoying the vices he enabled here, decided to stay, often turning on the TV and clearing his throat, making a deep, stark throat-clear noise that sometimes wakes up guests. Then there are also rumors that some of the young individuals that perished in the old fire also linger. Front desk staff have reported time and time again that guests will call their rooms late into the night and complain that they need to get up to whatever their floor is and tell those kids to stop playing in the hallways. The children, of course, are never seen or heard by the staff, though they say that if you ask the seemingly empty hallway to quiet down, they're not bad kids and they'll listen and let you get some sleep. Further, the Palmer House doesn't shy away from its less lively guests either. On its own very website, it lists its hauntings for the world to see, and there are enough accounts here that I could spend hours just describing them. Because of that, let's let the first-hand accounts speak for themselves, and share a few of these haunted spots in the hotel. To begin, there are records that someone had weird experiences in room 17. The guest heard their name being called when they were the only one, not just in the room, but on the entire floor of the hotel, according to the lobby. They described the voice as that of a woman. Further, another guest in the room with her felt sadness overcome her, and later that night in bed, they felt someone lay down on top of her. Now, I can't exactly explain the name-calling, but as someone who has a job and found that this account was submitted regarding an incident that occurred on a Sunday, I'm officially diagnosing the sadness part, at least, as a case of Sunday scaries. Then, in 2006, someone staying here was walking down the stairs and heard a weird thump-thump-thump sound, and they looked up, and in front of them, there was the shape of an old man with a cane that was broken. The man would then look up at the guest, smile, and evaporate in front of them. So, anyhow, that's the Palmer House. Now, I've been wanting to get back to Minnesota, and if I do, I'll be sure to pay the Palmer House a visit. Tucked away along the shorelines of Lake Superior in Duluth, Minnesota, is the Glensheen Mansion. According to its website, it's one of the city's crown jewels, a stately 39-room mansion built in 1905 for the Congdon family, one of the most influential families in the region's history. At the time of its construction, the home was a marvel of luxury and innovation, and it was commissioned by Chester Congdon, a lawyer, mining executive, and philanthropist who, with his wife Clara, invested in both business and the community. And they were known not just for their wealth, but for their generosity, donating to schools, churches, and civic causes across the Northland. Now, sadly, Chester would pass away in 1916, leaving the mansion to his daughter, Elizabeth Congdon, a quiet and kind-hearted woman who never married and devoted much of her life to charitable work. She lived in Glensheen for decades, a quiet presence and a grand home. But the Congdon family legacy is not what most people remember when they hear the name Glensheen. See, on the night of June 27th of 1977, a horror entered the historic home. Elizabeth, then 83 years old, was found smothered with a pillow in her bedroom. Her nurse, Velma, was then discovered at the foot of a staircase, bludgeoned with a candlestick of all things. A brutal and seemingly pretty personal act, and the investigation pointed to Roger Caldwell, the troubled and debt-ridden husband of Elizabeth's adopted daughter, Marjorie. He was convicted, though the full details and motivations have remained murky. Marjorie herself was later charged with conspiracy, but never convicted. The murders actually shocked the community, not just because of who the victims were, but because it happened inside of what was considered one of the safest and probably most opulent homes in all of Minnesota. In the aftermath, the mansion was left to the University of Minnesota Duluth, as per Elizabeth's will. They opened the home for public tours, but for decades, the story of the murder was deliberately avoided by these tours. Tour guides were instructed not to mention it, and the master bedroom where Elizabeth was smothered was kept closed to the public. That's changed, though, in recent years. The room has been restored, and while the focus is still on the historical significance of the Congdon family and the architecture, visitors have started to ask questions, and sometimes they leave with more than just answers. Today, Glensheen isn't just a historical site. It's one of Minnesota's most quietly haunted landmarks. Guests on tours here, especially those who linger near the main staircase, often report a sudden drop in temperature, or an unexplained wave of sadness right at the landing where Velma was taken from us. Shadowy figures are also said to move through the upstairs hallways, glimpsed out of the corner of the eye, but gone whenever you turn. Further, some have claimed to see two women walking side by side, dressed in early 20th century clothing, gliding silently through the corridors before fading into the shadows. It's, of course, said to be Elizabeth and her nurse, forever tied to the place where their lives were so violently taken. So they say that from nearly every point in Duluth, if you look uphill, you'll see it. A stone tower rising out of the trees in Enger Park, quietly watching the city it's come to symbolize. That's Enger Tower, a rugged, 5-story monument perched atop the hill in Enger Park, overlooking the harbor, Lake Superior, and the city's neighborhoods below. It's a favorite for sunset walks, panoramic views, and for those in the know, ghost stories. The tower and the park it crowns are named for Bert Enger, a Norwegian immigrant who arrived in the Midwest as a child in the early 1900s. Enger found success in Duluth as a furniture dealer and businessman, and by 1920 he'd earned a small fortune. In a lasting gesture of gratitude to his adopted city, he donated $50,000 to create a public park in the scenic Western Highlands. And after his death, the tower was built in his honor, completed in 1939. Clad in local bluestone, Enger Tower has an undeniable presence. It's tall, quiet, and a little bit foreboding, and it has a medieval look and a lonely perch. It feels kind of like a place that ought to be haunted, and by most accounts, it is. The most persistent legend tied to Enger Tower involves a mysterious man seen staring silently from the 5th floor window. Witnesses say they catch a glimpse of him from the park below, a silhouette unmoving in the top window. But when curious visitors climb the stairs, they always find the room empty. Local lore claims that in 1948, a man that isn't named or identified leapt from the tower and passed away on the stone below. Now, to be clear, there are no official records to back up this story, but the tale is stuck, perhaps because it fits the place. The man, whoever he was, is now believed, of course, to still haunt the top floor, gazing out at the city one last time and never leaving. There are other stories, too. Visitors sometimes hear footsteps echoing up and down the spiral staircase, though no one is coming or going. And others, of course, while scaling the tower, report hearing whispers or muffled voices coming from above, especially on cool gray days when fog hangs low over the hills. They climb naturally to investigate and always find themselves alone. Further, at night, shadowy figures are said to drift around the base of the tower, disappearing into the trees. Now, whether it's the same man trying to return to the top or something older still, no one really knows, but that's the story. If you drive north out of Duluth and turn off Rice Lake Road past where the city noise begins to fade into the trees and quiet, you'll find a small overgrown trail winding across Chester Creek. The path leads to what looks like nothing more than a clearing in the woods, but it's not just any clearing. Beneath the grass and the scrub lies Greenwood Cemetery, or what used to be Greenwood Cemetery, I guess, one of Duluth's most quietly haunted places, both by spirits and history itself. Greenwood began not as a cemetery out of choice, but out of necessity. In the late 1800s, when Duluth was still growing out of the mud and sawdust of its own making, the city's poorest citizens were sent to the St. Louis County Poor Farm, a sprawling institution meant to house those who had nowhere else to go. The old, the sick, and the jobless. And when they passed away, as most did without family or funds, they were laid to rest in a small patch of ground behind the Poor Farm, which I should note later doubled as a nursing home and was then later tied to a prison. This ground, though, where people were laid to rest, became Greenwood Cemetery, or as some old-timers called it, the Greenwood Pauper Cemetery. Between 1890 and 1947, roughly 4,700 people were buried here. Farmers, miners, sailors, lumberjacks, immigrants, you name it. The very people who actually helped build Duluth, though few would ever know their names. Records on who was actually buried here are sparse, often incomplete, and sometimes altogether wrong. And it wasn't until a 2012 research project by the Twin Ports Genealogical Society that a proper index of names was compiled, a fragile attempt at restoring some dignity to this cemetery. Originally, each grave here was marked with a simple wooden cross, but Duluth winters aren't kind, and time is even less kind, so the wood rotted and the names on that wood disappeared, and today there are basically no markers left. The county did later replace some with small numbered stones, but even those are scattered and inconsistent. The land feels more like a field than a cemetery, kind of a quiet, unassuming space that hides an immense amount of history underground. In the 1960s, when nearby roads were widened, construction crews accidentally unearthed over 100 coffins, too. The bodies were then reburied elsewhere, within Greenwood, but the empty coffins were often left behind. Decades later, in 2018, during another road project, workers discovered more lidless caskets, and even a single human bone, a grim reminder of the poor record-keeping and the indignities suffered by the people buried here. And yet, for all its sorrow, Greenwood Cemetery isn't entirely forgotten. Local historians and genealogists have fought to preserve it as a historic site, and the land is now protected. No longer used for burials, but never to be disturbed again. Of course, any place with a past like that is bound to have stories, and Greenwood has a few. Locals whisper that if you walk the path here at dusk, you might feel a chill, even on a warm evening. Some say they've heard faint coughing in the wind, perhaps some of those who had tuberculosis here taking one last breath. And others claim to have seen shadowy figures moving through the nearby trees, or felt the unmistakable feeling of being watched when nobody's there. The folks on the YouTube channel North Shore Paranormal once even came here, with cameras rolling and recorders in hand, and during their session, their voice recorder picked up a voice, a stern, disembodied command, saying go. Then more words followed. It said Frank, 7, and seance, and then, in a whisper that scares even me, it said die, and then finally again, go. So anyhow, if EVPs are to be believed, then the ghosts here don't seem to want visitors. Dead Man's Trail is a partially paved walking path nestled in Thief River Falls, Minnesota, that, at face value, looks like stuff I walk on every day. Part of it is essentially just a paved greenway that runs along a nearby river, and the other is an unpaved, more natural, and supposedly a little more haunted part. As for the history to back this area up, it's simple stuff. Historically, the region was home to the Ojibwe, or Chippewa, with Dakota Sioux that were also present in the broader region. And there are some whispers that along the river where this story takes place, the Dakota once had a secret fortified encampment at one point that was discovered and attacked by the Ojibwe, and this part possibly lends credence to this story. And as for the story itself, it's always set with this backdrop. It follows a young Native American woman who's traveling or walking in these woods with her newborn or young child. Where she's heading, the story never really tells, but it usually suggests she's running from something or someone, and that this someone might be getting closer, thus thinking her child is slowing her down. In most stories, they say that she hides her child near this fast-moving river, hoping that, number one, the sound of the river, the loud, rushing sound of the water, covers up its cries and hides it, and two, hoping that she can speed up and get away from her pursuers and circle back to retrieve her child later. Now, as you might expect, for whatever reason, this never goes well. In pretty much all tellings, the woman returns to find that the child was somehow swept away in the river, never to be seen again. And thus, the region gained 2 new ghosts on this day. To begin, there's of course the child, who actually passed on in this incident. Today they say that particularly when the river is running fast, if you walk along this trail at night, at first you'll hear whistling. Or maybe it's not whistling, maybe it's the faint cries of a child in the night air. And once that noise catches your attention, they say that you might also hear the faint sounds of crying, but this time not from a child. Rather, these cries seem to be coming from an adult woman, and that possibly, if you're unlucky, you might stumble upon the apparition of this woman still roaming the banks of the river, searching for the child that she lost centuries ago. This story has cemented itself into local folklore, and if you do a bit of digging on this topic, you'll find plenty of forum posts from folks who have claimed to visit this location and walk the banks of this river, only to turn to the internet and claim that late at night they too have heard these screams and cries of a woman and child, still hoping to find one another even after all these years. The James J. Hill House, as it's known today, was built by railroad magnate James J. Hill and finished in 1891. The mansion contains roughly 36,000 square feet, dozens of fireplaces and chandeliers, a long reception hall, and an ornate two-story art gallery. It was long considered the showcase of St. Paul by locals due to its opulence and imposing presence, and it remained the Hill family residence into the 20th century despite James himself passing away in 1915. Today, with the family gone though, it is now preserved and interpreted as a museum property and a National Historic Landmark, under the care of the Minnesota Historical Society. And this historical society, well, they're very into history as you might expect, so much so that they want to keep it history. And from what I've read, they have a firm stance that this old mansion is purely just that, a historical landmark, and not a place where the history lingers to this day. They say it isn't haunted. That said, like so many Gilded Age homes, others claim the house has attracted ghosts. One of the principal hauntings here is claimed to be an individual named Maud Hill, the estranged wife of James Hill's son Louis. Now, to be clear, Maud is one of the friendly ghost varieties according to most. She doesn't scare you or turn her eyes jet black when she catches you giving a peck to your girlfriend on the property like other ghosts we've discussed. Rather, she's said to be most often seen as a quiet observer during some of the many concerts that are held in this mansion, where she'll be seen as a quiet individual in a corner, often watching and, of course, wearing clothing that seems a bit out of place. Further, I should note, I'm actually contractually obligated by my boss to cover any and all pet-related hauntings I come across, and in this light, they say that on the third floor of the home, there's a small dog that was once the family pet. And they say from time to time, even though there aren't any dogs living here today, you'll hear the soft sound of metal touching metal, as if this old dog's collar is jingling against itself as it runs down the hallway. Sometimes they say you'll feel warm breath and a slimy sensation on your leg, as if you've just been licked by a spectral good boy that's still hoping for some pets. As for the name of this dog, sadly I couldn't find it anywhere, but despite this, they say a puppy is around. Further, a bit of trivia, while this home wasn't the set for the filming of The Haunting of Hill House, this manor is one of the homes that inspired it from my reading. And also, it has the same name. And I can't blame the writers. Looking at a photo of this mansion, I don't think you could, from scratch, design a more fittingly stereotypical haunted place in my eyes. And if you haven't seen it, not to get into media, I think that The Haunting of Hill House that was put out on Netflix back in 2018 might be one of the best shows I've ever seen, though viewer discretion is very much advised. In Owatonna, Minnesota, there's a museum in modern day that was once much more than a place to show off artifacts and demonstrate the lives of those that came before us. Between 1886 and 1945, over 10,000 children lived here, orphaned children, and it was one of the largest orphanages in the entire country during this period. The orphanage, of course, was founded to care for orphaned children who lost their parents, alongside many other facilities like this that were founded in the USA to respond to the growing number of orphaned children in the country, something that surged as cities experienced industrial growth. The home was officially founded in 1886. It was built as a large brick Victorian, operated by various religious organizations. Here, children not only lived, but they were also educated, taught some domestic skills, and they were taken care of by staff, hoping to provide these kids with the tools they needed to become productive members of society when they got older. That said, the building would cease being an orphanage in 1945, and it would be repurposed, as during the mid-20th century, nationally, there was a trend which moved away from institutionalized care and towards foster care, and it rode that wave. It had many uses from then on until the 1990s, when it was ultimately made into a museum to preserve this history and the stories of those kids who once lived here. That said, while this place was, in large, doing its best to make a positive impact in the lives of the children who otherwise were lost or alienated from their families, not all was hunky-dory here. And as we've seen in prior iterations of these Haunted Places videos, not all of the orphans who enter these facilities left alive. It's in this light that we'll discuss our first haunting, and the best-known one in this modern museum, that of a young woman named Lily. Lily, it's said, passed away sometime in the early 1900s during a harsh Minnesota winter, and we've heard a story similar to this one in an orphanage we covered last October in our Michigan's Haunted Places video. To be brief, Lily, they say, she went out to play in the snow when she wasn't supposed to. She didn't ask for permission, and thus she got locked out and suffered a terrible price for that. Locked out of the orphanage and exposed to the winter cold, she caught a cold that developed into pneumonia, and before long she would ultimately fall quiet. Thus, they say that Lily still walks the halls of this orphanage. Sometimes visitors report to hear giggling or laughter of a young girl, and there's a few reports of this from staff too. And a lucky few will hear this and turn around, only to see a young woman in Victorian dress smiling at them before running off into a closed room or around a corner, never to be seen again. Further, while I couldn't find any records of these kids passing, there are other children that are said to roam these halls too, perhaps attracted back to the fond memories they had here. Some have reported hearing the laughter or whispered voices of multiple kids in the building, often reporting that it sounds like they're playing with a ball or occasionally playing hide and seek. In reference to the latter, I actually saw one pretty creepy account of a man who was visiting the museum and thought he heard hushed whispering, only to look into the corner of a room, kind of behind a dresser or a similar object, only to see a young boy and a young girl huddled up next to each other, peering around the object at him, like, of course, they were playing hide and seek and they'd just been found. There are other more tangible phenomena too. For instance, it's common to have your pant leg or jacket tugged on while you're inside of this building, and if you're lucky and you let your phone record some audio, they also say you might catch a child's voice asking you questions from the distant corners of the room. Just 10 miles away as the crow flies and a bit downriver of Pike Island, the island we covered first in this video, is another potentially haunted island. What do you know? This one's named Grey Cloud Island. Admittedly, this island's history is similar, if a little bit less dramatic and tragic than that of Pike Island. See, this place was long occupied by Native Americans, and is therefore home to many of their burial grounds, with evidence of Native occupation dating as far back as 1700 BCE. And as recently as the 1800s, this island was home to a village of Dakota natives, with the island's indigenous name, Mapeahotawin, which hopefully I said correctly, and I meant no ill will if I didn't, translating to Grey Cloud Woman's Place. Today, though, the island's use is far less interesting. There's a large sand and gravel operation on it, and some barge shipping that passes through, and there's a bit of recreational camping and trails that call this place home. That said, from my reading, it doesn't matter if its modern use is mundane. If it used to be home to the natives, and if it has even a whiff of burial on it, which it does, folks will say it's haunted, which means we have plenty of interesting activity in modern day. To begin, the most well-known haunting on this island is said to be that of the Green Witch, which is sometimes referred to as the Green Lantern. And what this haunting is highly variable. Many, of course, claim that this green light that's often seen floating here at night is the residual haunting of an old Native American medicine woman, whose child, they say, went missing on the island. Thus, in her panic, she went out, and for many nights in the cold winter, she searched for her child, lantern in hand, until she herself succumbed to the elements. And now they say she roams this island with this green light for all eternity in search of her child. And regarding that child, they say that she still haunts the island too, as is evidenced by the hushed whisper of a child who's been heard urging folks that visit the island to leave and to never come back on EVPs. Further, some other sources say this Green Lantern is the apparition of a Native American chief that used to call this island home. And while this version doesn't necessarily report what he was or is doing with that lantern, they say that when you see it, the lights are often accompanied by the hushed beating of drums. Now, as for this green light legend, I did find something sort of fun, a potential explanation for its origin. I saw claims that these stories may have originated in the 1960s, when one of the caretakers for Grey Cloud Island's campgrounds would quietly patrol the island, looking for folks parked on the quiet roads to do some lover's laning, if you catch my drift. And right when things got spicy in the car, he'd apparently approach their car, peer in the window, which is a little bit gross, and shine a flashlight on his face while screaming. They say that this may be the origin of the Green Witch legend that dot this place today. Further, I found another legend on this island that, funny enough, we've seen before in a couple places, that claim that on this island there's a group of 12 tombstones tombstones that used to belong to nuns. And if you count them in one direction, there will be 12. And then if you go the other way, there won't be 12. There will be 10 or 11 or 9 or whatever. Admittedly, I don't think this is proof of the afterlife or anything. It's probably more likely an optical illusion or just a stark reminder that you should have studied harder when you took math in high school. The University of Minnesota was chartered in 1851, 7 years before Minnesota was even a state, beginning life as a preparatory school named St. Anthony's Falls on the Mississippi River. Now, like many universities, it would stumble for a little bit around the time of the Civil War. It closed for a bit in 1861, but ultimately it was resurrected in 1867, and in 1869 it became a full-fledged university. The university would then go on to expand in academic breadth through the late 1800s and 1900s, awarding its first PhD in 1888, and it went on to distinguish itself in medicine and engineering in the mid-20th centuries through breakthroughs like artificial heart valves and the portable pacemaker, and even producing innovations like, I kid you not, the Honeycrisp apple, among many other less important breakthroughs like open-heart surgery. All of this today, of course, has added up to a top-tier and historically significant learning institution that many bright minds come from. But here's the thing. There's a thing about bright minds, not that I'd understand, but they're often troubled, and while their impact is great, their sense of self-worth is not. And sadly, all too often at the University of Minnesota, we've seen this play out in a sad way. In this light is the university's Washington Avenue Bridge that runs across the Mississippi River from the western to the eastern portion of campus. This bridge's first iteration dates back to 1884, but the modern version was built in 1965, and it's since been upgraded to accommodate bicycles, pedestrians, and even the city's light rail. But the thing is, tall bridges that run over frozen rivers have a habit of inviting less than happy activities. Thus, this place has a nasty history. Lots of folks have, let's say, tried to fly here, with the most notable being Professor John Berryman, a Pulitzer Prize winner for poetry for his work 77 Dream Songs. You may have even heard of it. It was here, on this bridge in 1972, that he would take a leap, and since then, 7 more have followed him, some willing, others not so much. It's sad stuff, and again, as I say a lot here, if you're struggling, please seek help. You're a friend to me, and you're strong enough to get through this. That said, today, because of this profound sadness that has called this bridge home, many claim that this bridge has a habit of replaying tragic memories for a select few folks that walk over it. To begin, I found a handful of accounts across the internet of folks saying that as they walked over this bridge, particularly in the winter, on snowy nights, they observed what appeared as a silhouette approaching the edge and taking a jump. They, of course, will rush to the edge and look over it, only to notice that suddenly, whoever it was that jumped is no longer falling, and where they stood just moments before, there are no footprints in the snow. And of course, many say that among these taking a fateful phantom leap is an old man with a bushy beard and thick-brimmed glasses, a man that looks an awful lot like John Berryman. Then there's Pioneer Hall. Pioneer Hall is a residence hall that was built in phases. Its first wing was built in 1930 and the second in 1934, and it originally functioned as an all-male dorm on the east bank of campus. Today, though, it's much larger than its original iteration and holds 756 beds and a dining hall. My impression is that Pioneer is a bit of a campus hub, if you will, and that today, despite its windows being upgraded to have metal frames, the large number of folks that gaze upon its dark wooden door frames make one wonder if at some point in life it may have been something more than a residence hall. Lore says, as you might expect, that in the past, before it was a dorm, it was actually a hospital. To be specific, a psychiatric hospital, which housed patients of the Fairview Hospital just across Southeast Harvard Street. This lore claims that, for the most part, this role was short-lived and went on without a hitch, but that there was one blemish. They say that there was a girl put here who the doctors and nurses thought was profoundly troubled by a mental illness, but in actuality, she wasn't haunted by a health concern, but instead she was possessed. Some even go so far as to say this woman was the original inspiration for the exorcism of Emily Rose. And to lend some credence, I've seen accounts that throughout this dorm, you'll still hear weird noises at night, distant voices echoing the halls, rattling in the walls, and tip-tap noises that almost sound like someone is slowly walking around your room. And as for who's making them, well, they say that this possessed woman may have passed on in the building, but that her spirit decided to stay behind. And for some reason, her whole mission in the afterlife is to make strange noises, I guess. Quickly though, before we move on, we need a fast reality check. As I said, this hall was built in the 1930s exclusively for students. It is not and was not a psychiatric hospital at any point, and all this mumbo-jumbo about ghosts is probably just mumbo-jumbo. Or at the very least, the ghost in question wasn't necessarily a product of an asylum because this place was always a simple dorm. Then there's also the Northrop Auditorium, the campus theater. This auditorium was built in 1929 as an ode to Cyrus Northrop, the university's second president, and ever since then it's been a performing hall, lecture space, and a general community events center. That said, like any theater worth its salt, it's also got a ghost story. Now, this ghost isn't front and center like some on this list, but they say back in 1929, right after it opened, and until the 1960s, it had the same exact manager. This manager, by all accounts, was a nice man to others, and he loved this theater that was his place of business. That said, he also had a vice, alcohol, and they say that rather than quit his job, he passed away a working man from cirrhosis. But instead of moving on to the afterlife, he decided that it was in his best interest to just go straight from the morgue back to work. And thus, to this day, many say you'll see his ghost lingering in the premises. To begin, this manager's specter is usually seen on the balcony, but sometimes also on the stage from a distance by modern employees. Usually they say he's simply observing what's going on around him. When he's on the balcony, that would be a performance or a rehearsal, and he never interacts with anyone or anything while he's there. He's also been seen occasionally by ushers who have reported to see a man wearing a suit pacing while stroking his chin on the 4th floor, a man that shouldn't be there, and who disappears shortly after being seen. Further, sometimes during rehearsals, when there's not a single person in the audience, those performing will report that they hear a single pair of hands, faintly clapping, as if they just nailed their lines for an audience of one. The stately brick building, now known as D.B. Searles, rose in 1886 in downtown St. Cloud, commissioned by Dolson Bush Searle, the namesake of this place, a Civil War veteran, New York native, attorney, and prominent local businessman. Searle lived a remarkable life before ever coming to Minnesota. He fought for the Union and saw combat at Bull Run, and in one of history's eerier coincidences, he was actually present in the Ford Theater on the night of President Lincoln's assassination. After the war, he made his name in St. Cloud, eventually constructing the 3-story multi-purpose building on 5th Avenue South that still bears his name, or I guess the restaurant in it bore his name. From 1886 to 1897, this building served as the home to the German-American Bank, whose original vault still sits near the rear bar, an iron relic of its first life. Searle kept his personal office there as well, while a Masonic lodge occupied the upper floor until about 1912. Over the decades that followed, the building cycled through tenants, including additional banks, a musicians association, a motor company, and most notably a funeral home that operated on the premises from 1939 to 1970. After years of mixed use and eventual decline, the building was condemned in 1975, but local businessman Bill Nagley purchased and restored it, reopening the space as a restaurant and entertainment venue in 1978 under the name D.B. Searles. It remained a St. Cloud fixture until it closed in 2018. This said, any building with a Masonic lodge, a bank vault, and 3 straight decades as a funeral home has absolutely met the minimum requirements to be haunted, and D.B. Searles has long been the subject of ghostly rumors in St. Cloud because of this. Staff, over the years, reported that alarms go off in the building for no reason. Furniture will shift overnight, glasses will move and sometimes fall to the floor on their own, and the sound of footsteps on empty floors after closing is common. Further, the old vault in particular is a hotspot for cold drafts and sudden unexplained noises. Some believe that the spirits of the former funeral home tenants, or perhaps those who passed through its care, never fully left. But the most frequently seen ghost is Dolson Bush Searle himself. According to one well-circulated local legend, Searle still wanders his old office and the upper floors, checking in on the building he erected and refusing to relinquish ownership, even after death. Thus, guests claim to have seen a shadowy man in 19th century clothing pacing the upstairs hall or looking out a third-floor window late at night. Others point to Masonic history, wondering if secretive rituals, symbolic artifacts, and the ever-popular "what were they doing up there" energy was fuel enough to send a spirit, or perhaps even a demon, this place's way. Whether it's a spirit from the funeral home era, Searles himself, or simply an echo of a very long history, locals and former employees insist this building still has activity. And ghost stories, unlike restaurants, don't close down. As long as this brick facade stands on Fifth Avenue, St. Cloud, I imagine, will keep whispering about the things that walk in here after dark. So, quick check-in, folks. Am I hallucinating, or does Minnesota have a lot of haunted islands? Nanny Nan, Tony, I know you'll probably get to this point, so let me know what you think. Am I crazy, or is this an inordinate amount of haunted islands? Anyhow, this particular story, at least, isn't about a haunted island in a traditionally haunted sense. There aren't any translucent women floating around in white dresses, nor are there stories of the pitter-patter of children's feet across the island as you walk its shores. Rather, Star Island is haunted in a different sense. See, it's connected to the Native American mythos of the Windigo, a malevolent spirit in Algonquian folklore, and further, it's the location of the last known Windigo ceremony ever, something we'll discuss in a second. Now, to give a little more context first, Star Island is an island that's already in a lake, Lake Vermilion in northeast Minnesota. This island has some level of prominence because it's tied to Native American tradition, and it has some historical sites on it. And Windigo Lake itself is a lake that is inside of Star Island. So this is an island on Lake Vermilion, and Windigo Lake is a lake on this island inside of a lake within a lake, and this lake is a very notorious spot. It's a place where they say evil was perhaps purged, and the last of a very powerful variety of ceremonies was ever publicly held. First off, these ceremonies, labeled as Windigo ceremonies, were performed by the indigenous people of the Great Lakes and the Upper Midwest to address spiritual afflictions that were believed to have been caused by a Windigo spirit possessing an individual, or sometimes an entire community. These were essentially ceremonies that could purge the person or the whole group of this spirit. And as for this spirit, well, it's terrifying. Traditionally, the Windigo is powerful and dangerous, and its description is largely a product of Algonquian-speaking indigenous people like the Ojibwe, the Cree, the Innu, and some other groups. This spirit is cannibalistic, and its most notable trait is that it typically appears during periods of famine or other crises, often in the winter when starvation and isolation could bring out the worst in people. The Windigo spirit is often also affiliated with greed, existing as a sort of symbolic warning that your insatiable greed, sometimes to do something as simple as eating, is dangerous during times when cooperation among the community for survival is vital. Thus, one may become a Windigo if during a time of famine, for instance, they resorted to cannibalism, or they might be possessed by a Windigo spirit alternatively and begin to exhibit inhuman hunger, violence, or something as simple as detachment from their community. Most of the details about these ceremonies I found were vague, and I couldn't find any evidence of one, but the descriptions I found say they were performed during times of famine, and involved wearing ceremonial masks and dancing backwards around a drum. They also involved the use of chants, prayers, and sacred objects, and the very last one of these ever reported to have been held occurred right here, on Star Island, around Windigo Lake, in the late 19th or early 20th centuries. Thus, they say that on this island, a member of their community was thought to have been possessed by a Windigo spirit, and therefore they held this ceremony in hopes of a cure. That's all. There's no formal record of this event committed to paper, and all we have left of it is some second-hand accounts told today by indigenous leaders that on this island, something terrifying and rare once dwelled. On the west side of St. Paul, carved into the soft white sandstone bluffs just across the Mississippi from downtown, sits one of the strangest pieces of Minnesota history, the Wabasha Street Caves. Unlike most caverns, these aren't the work of nature. They are entirely man-made. Beginning in the 1840s, miners dug into the bluffs to remove sandstone and silica, used for glass-making and building materials. This digging, of course, left caverns that at first had strange uses. Now, to be fair, my first thought when thinking of a use for a space that remains moist and at a constant temperature all year would be refrigeration, or possibly saving money on my utility bill. But initially, these good people of Minnesota thought this would be an excellent place to grow mushrooms and store food, which is totally fair. So from the late 1800s to the early 1900s, this was a mushroom growing facility. But that's just the warm-up act. During Prohibition, like nearly every hole in the ground in America, these caves got an upgrade. They cleaned out the mushrooms and transformed them into a speakeasy and nightclub. By 1933, this place was known as Castle Royale, a full mob cash-infused, highly illegal entertainment place, complete with a ballroom, stage, dance floor, and expensive $1 dinners, and a reputation for hosting some very thirsty gangster clientele. Now, after the glitz faded, in the late 1930s and World War II arrived, and drinking became legal again, the caves ceased their underground mob-affiliated practices and went back to mushroom farming for a bit, and today the cave serves less practical purposes, as a simple event venue and a site for historical tours. Despite this, if you believe the stories, even though the caves are relatively unused now, they have no shortage of permanent residents. Rumors of hauntings in these caves are everywhere, with stories that explain the ghosts, ranging from mysterious deaths to bodies supposedly sealed in the sandstone walls beside you as you tour the place. The most famous legend centers on the Fireside Room, said to have been a gangster hangout during the speakeasy years. According to local lore, 4 mobsters were playing cards here when a stranger with a briefcase asked them to leave. The men, of course, stepped out towards the Fireside Room, leaving behind a waitress who suddenly heard bursts of gunfire from a Tommy gun. When she rushed into this fireside room, she supposedly found 3 of these gangsters passed away on the floor. She, of course, did the responsible thing and called the police. But by the time the authorities arrived, everything was spotless. There were no bodies, there was no blood, and there was no crime scene. Just a nice, clean room. Legend says the men were either buried in the walls or quietly handled by the police, who couldn't be bothered with more paperwork. As if paperwork is more trouble than cleaning up bodies. But hey, what do I know? Thus, today, people touring the Fireside Room report seeing men in 1920s suits and fedoras, who will go about their business before promptly vanishing through the solid stone walls. Guides say that guests often assume they're watching costumed actors, right up until the actor walks through a wall, like it's a Nintendo customer dumping the company after hearing the word Day 1 DLC. Paranormal claims don't stop there either. Musicians from the 1970s nightclub era swore equipment would actually fly off the stage on its own. Further, there's a supposed photograph shown on tours but curiously impossible to track down online, reportedly showing a child smiling beside misty ghostly figures at a wedding reception. And speaking of kids, there's another story of a boy bouncing a ball into the restroom, only to emerge and claim that he saw a gangster in there who winked at him before disappearing. So apparently the hitmen here are very nice to modern-day kids at least. Now, if you want to see the caves and maybe meet a fedora-loving specter for yourself that hopefully doesn't say milady, you can tour them for about 1500s. Just don't play cards in the Fireside Room, or if you do, maybe don't stick around when a man with a mysterious briefcase walks in. In the spring of 1887, the Field family lived in St. Olaf Township, near the town of Dalton, Minnesota, in Otter Tail County. For context, back in the late 19th century, this area was rural, and this farm was remote, meaning that communication and law enforcement here would have been slow, if lacking infrastructure for those activities entirely. The family in question here included Mother Priscilla, or Miss Fields as they said, the older son Charles, a younger son William, known as Clark in some accounts, of about 6 years old, and a daughter Lily, of about 15 years old. Their father, Alfonso Field, passed by his own hands about 8 months before this story takes place, leaving the farm behind to the mother and children. According to later accounts, the hired farm worker that year was one Nels Olsen Holong. On Thursday, May 26th of 1887, Priscilla Field and her older son Charles left the farm by horse and wagon, heading towards Fergus Falls to run errands. Left behind on the farm that day were Lily, who was 15 again, and William, who was 6, and of course Nels Holong, their hired hand. So as for the chronology of this day, the details we know are, well, strange and a bit sad. To begin, Holong, having been at the barn doing chores, entered the house and asked Lily to make him a cup of coffee. She declined, saying she had chores of her own, and told him to make his own coffee. Then Holong made the strange request that I don't see followed up, asking Lily for a picture of herself apparently, something she refused. Again, that's really weird. Holong next would send the younger brother, William Clark, to a neighbor to fetch a scoop shovel, and told him to stop and play for a little while on his way back. The boy obliged, and after doing this he would return later, and when he returned, his sister and Holong were gone. That evening, Priscilla, the mother, and Charles, the older brother, returned at around 11 p.m. They found William asleep on the couch, lamp burning, but Lily and Ho Long were gone. The next morning, May 27th, Charles went out to feed livestock and noticed that the cattle hadn't been tended to as they should have been by Ho Long, and then he walked through the hog pasture and he found his sister Lily's body among the hogs. She'd been taken apart, let's say, and the hogs had kind of started to eat her. Ho Long, of course, among this, was nowhere to be found, but swiftly he was searched for and captured near Wendell Station on the Minneapolis and Pacific Railroad about 30 miles away. He confessed, at least, to disposing of the body to the hogs, but Ho Long denied that he was the one that did this. At his trial, later in 1887, he was convicted of first-degree murder in a very short jury deliberation. According to historical county records, Ho Long was hung on April 13th of 1888, and this was actually the first legal execution in all of Otter Tail County. Now, over the decades since this tragedy, the story of Lily Fields has translated from one of a tragedy to a bit of a ghost story on its own. It's said that in the short while after this tragedy, and for the generations since, folks have visited this old pig farm's location and wandered the woods around it. Which, I should note, I couldn't for the life of me find the location of, but it's said that they are today on private property. Despite this, people supposedly come here, looking for the ghost of Lily Fields, and to hear these strange, supposed spectral sounds that ring out like a sour memory. Some, of course, say that if you get close to where this farm used to be on the right night, you'll hear the sounds of pigs squealing, and the thorny trees and bushes will start to snag you, kind of like they're reaching out for you from the woods in this location. And then, if you're extra lucky, they say that among the sounds of pigs, you'll hear faint screams coming from a pig farm that no longer exists. Today, if we're being polite, Beltrami Park doesn't exactly scream mystery. It's a pleasant neighborhood, and honestly, as someone who doesn't own a house, I'd sign up for a well-priced mortgage here in a heartbeat. But the park itself, at first glance, it's nice. Nice in the way a plain slice of toasted white bread is nice. You'll eat it. You'll enjoy it. It might even have a satisfying crunch, but it's no brioche. There's no rich, buttery drama happening on that surface. But here's the twist. Much like a really good sourdough, Beltrami Park has layers. If you start digging, metaphorically, or maybe literally, you'd find a surprisingly deep history beneath its simple exterior. Alright, I'm done with the bread metaphors. It's been a long month of haunted research, and carbs are clearly on my mind. See, from 1857 to the 1890s, this land wasn't a place for recreation. Rather, it was a cemetery, a burial site for over 5,000 individuals ranging from Civil War veterans to simple early citizens of Minneapolis. That said, like many cemeteries we see, this one was neglected, and by the late 1800s they ceased the burials and moved a large fraction of those interred here to the nearby Hillside Cemetery, about 1,300 of them to be precise, to respect these dead, though they left the vast majority of these individuals behind. Now, the intention, to be clear, was to just keep this cemetery, with a now reduced population, up as usual. But around the early 1900s, you can literally find reports of caskets starting to poke up through the ground. So clearly health officials and the Minneapolis Parks Board weren't winning that war. Further, and if someone actually understands how this happened, please chime in, it seems like people started to just visit this ex-cemetery, which apparently had caskets poking out of the ground, for recreation. Some local Italians would play bocce ball here, I kid you not, and that frequent activity transformed this park into a recreational destination, Beltrami Park, a title it still holds today, despite the fact that there are many remnants of its time as a cemetery still. Now, as for the hauntings here, to be clear, they're a bit mundane, but given over 3,700 are buried under the ground here, it's no surprise that they exist. The most frequent account comes from residents of the nearby neighborhoods that claim that even in the dead of night, they'll sometimes see someone standing motionless in Beltrami Park, usually staring down at the ground, as if digesting the fact that they're staring at their own grave. Further, some have reported that as they play bocce ball or pick up soccer, they've felt watched and heard faint voices carrying their name on the wind. One particularly chilling account even tells of a police officer who was called to warn off a trespasser in this park back in 2017, and he claimed that when he arrived, he actually saw the perpetrator, but as he approached him, the man sort of blended into the darkness, and when he ultimately got up to where the man was sitting, nobody was there, and there was no sign that anyone had been here. So, if you want to experience this scariness yourself, To this day in October, I found that a good man named Chris Lawler actually comes here and gives tours of what used to be Maple Hill Cemetery. So if you see this video 1 year before Halloween, and you want to take your kid for an excellent lesson in haunted history, you should definitely stop by this park. Now, on a video that is coming out just a couple of days before Halloween, you know I couldn't leave the self-proclaimed Halloween capital of the world off the list. Anoka, at least to those of us who watched the old History Channel documentary on Halloween, should be well known to many as the town that essentially curtailed Halloween, taking what was previously a night of mischief into the more tame and candy-fueled night we observe the nation across today. That said, as is only appropriate for a town that tamed this holiday, Anoka, Minnesota has a haunted place of its own, or really a few, but the Anoka State Hospital is probably the best-known haunted place in town. This site was originally commissioned in 1895 as a new transfer hospital for a, quote, the incurably insane, to relieve overcrowding in existing Minnesota asylums. And thus, in 1899, they began to build this place, opening it in March of 1900 to its first 100 male patients, and then to female patients in 1906, going on to expand further to roughly 900 patients and adding cottages, auditoriums, and more to accommodate them, with now infamous underground tunnels linking these buildings. Of course, like most asylums, by the 1940s, this hospital was overcrowded, leading to a bit of scandal. And at the turn of the century, it ceased being used as a mental health hospital, and today it's used as veteran housing and for some county uses. Even today, though, with the so-called incurably insane having left this place long ago, it's said that some still linger. Perhaps it's the memory of the many burials that occurred on site, as it's well known that many of the patients, some say 86 of the first 100 men for instance, passed away while kept here, only to be buried and labeled by number rather than by their birth names, as was customary for establishments like psychiatric hospitals and poor farms at the time. Further, it probably doesn't help that these buildings were built in the prime haunted era, and even a quick glance at photos of many of these condemned buildings will have you examine whether pale figures are glaring at you out of the building's windows. The shock therapy and other controversial procedures that were held here probably don't help its reputation either. It's in this light that many report that haunted is the norm rather than the exception here. To begin, many of those who visit this place, both legally and illegally, observe some of the now empty buildings from the outside and report to see figures peering out of windows, sometimes catching them on camera while doing so if you buy the evidence. Further, employees at this facility have reported to many that they've had strange experiences of their own. I found one individual who claimed that while cleaning one of the buildings that is still in use, he heard the loud sound of someone sneezing, and then swearing afterwards. The employee, of course, being a polite man, said, "Bless you," and in return he heard, "Thank you, sir." And then when he went in to clean that room, he found that not only was the light bulb burnt out, but that nobody was inside. He then checked the adjacent rooms and found they were empty too, and that he was pretty much the only person in the building, or at least on the floor of the building. It seemed that whoever he was talking to may have been on a different plane of reality, if you catch my drift. And then, the most haunted spot here is a place that few have the opportunity to enter, the tunnels that connected these buildings. Now, to be clear, ghost hunting is explicitly not allowed here, period, end of story. That said, a select few have gone down here and said it's creepy as all get out. Cold spots are frequently felt, which to be fair may be attributable to a draft existing between some of these buildings during the winter, but less easily explained is the fact that often, as people walk between buildings, they tell of seeing silent figures, sometimes in the distance, or occasionally passing them during these walks. People that they don't recognize, who make very little noise as their feet hit the concrete floors beneath them. Loon Lake Cemetery was established in 1876, perched on a hill overlooking the waters of Loon Lake. The massive pine trees that rise from its center can actually be seen for miles in any direction. Some say, too, that they were planted intentionally to mark the cemetery's resting grounds to those far away. Today, the site holds at least 100 souls, though not all of them arrived under the same circumstances. For instance, a handful of those buried here actually predate the cemetery's founding, having been dug up elsewhere, usually on private property, and reburied after this cemetery's establishment right here, where they wouldn't be moved. About 10% of the graves here have no documentation at all, and originally the cemetery was owned by a local Methodist church, but when that church burned down, the cemetery was more or less orphaned, and nobody's been buried here in roughly 90 years. Now, therefore, nature has reclaimed what's hers. The place is overgrown with prickly bushes, poison ivy, and tall prairie grass, which is supposedly crawling with ticks, all of which do an excellent job of dissuading casual visitors. And of course, scattered among the vegetation are the worn headstones, which are quiet reminders that beneath your feet lie the faint remnants of people who once lived, loved, and probably never imagined that their final resting place would become a TikTok backdrop. Most of the folks who make their way here aren't paying respect now. They're thrill seekers, YouTubers, and ghost hunters. Yes, I'll admit, people that I have a little bit in common with, but who are looking for their 5 minutes of fame, an EVP recording here or the ever-elusive orb photo there. But Loon Lake isn't just another decaying cemetery that's easy to access. It's famous because of one name etched into local legend: Mary Jane Turbelager. Mary was born in 1862 in Iowa as one of 8 children to John and Phoebe Turbelager, Illinois and North Carolina natives respectively. The family moved around a bit before settling down here, and John and Phoebe lived long, respectable lives, both making it well into the early 1900s. Phoebe even reached the age of 92, which in the 19th century made her basically immortal. Mary Jane, however, wasn't so lucky. In March of 1880, at just 17 years old, Mary Jane passed away, decades before her parents. Now, that alone might have made her name fade quietly into family history, except it didn't. According to the legend, Mary Jane Turbelager wasn't just dead, she was beheaded. The story goes that she was a witch, part of a local coven accused of terrorizing the good God-fearing townsfolks, and that's an actual quote, by the way, from the Weird USA book. Mary Jane supposedly wasn't the only one executed here. There were 2 other witches that were said to have been hunted down and buried in the area. And by buried, I mean these other 2, and for some reason not Mary Jane, were sunk in the actual Loon Lake, because, according to the story, witches didn't belong in consecrated ground. Yet it's Mary Jane who became the centerpiece of this tale, and legend claims she was interred here, with the very axe that took her head. And despite her being, dead, she apparently never actually left. Visitors to this cemetery in modern day report that they'll arrive on calm days, but then they'll feel gusts of cold wind, even on hot summer nights, and mysterious noises also echo through the pines around it. Some also claim that on camera they see glowing orbs floating among the gravestones, and while I'm not one to mistake dust particles for spirits, I'll humor you because I'm in a pretty good mood as I record this. But I will say, you might want to check if your lens is dirty before you go claiming that's a ghost. The most popular part of this legend, though, isn't just what you'll find here, rather it's the curse. They say that if you step on or over Mary Jane's grave, you're doomed to die within 72 hours. Now, I've seen plenty of Reddit posts, and as we all know, Reddit is the most reliable source on the planet, and also responsible for about 95% of the world's salt supply, that these people claim to have stepped over her grave and survived. Then again, maybe that's just because most of us on Reddit are already dead inside. Of course, there's one small problem with this whole story. It's total fiction. Fun fiction, sure, but fiction nonetheless. Mary Jane Turbelager did exist, and she did die young, but we have this amazing modern invention called records, and lucky for me, it doesn't seem HIPAA existed in the 1880s, so death certificates for her exist too, and they show that Mary Jane died of diphtheria in Cherokee, Iowa. No axe, no witch trial, no midnight beheading in the woods. So that begs the question, where did this legend come from? Now, according to Mike Kirchmeier, director of the Jackson County Historical Society, the whole Loon Lake witch thing started back in the 1880s with a local mill owner whose business went under. Rather than blaming, say, poor economics or his own poor management, he decided it must have been witches that caused his business to fail, naturally. Later, a bait and tackle shop near the cemetery started pushing the same story. The owners sold beer, and since the neighboring county was dry, people flocked here. And what better way to draw in a crowd than to tell them there's a haunted cemetery next door? Nothing like a few beers and a ghost story to boost sales. So in the end, the haunting of Loon Lake Cemetery isn't the tale of a witch's restless spirit. It's the tale of how gossip, commerce, and bad business decisions can keep a ghost story alive for over a century. So I reached out to a buddy of mine that lives in Minneapolis and I asked him, what's your favorite weird haunted place in Minnesota? And he said without hesitation that in Anoka, there's this quaint little bar and grill named Billy's that I should check out. Now I looked this place up, and admittedly the website looked nothing but, well, ordinary. The food looks decent, the place looks friendly, and there's absolutely no mention anywhere on the site that there's anything even remotely nefarious going on here. But if you dig around a little and search this place up through less official channels, you'll find something else entirely. See, over the years, the building that's now Billy's Bar and Grill has had many lives. It was first built in the 1800s, right there on Jackson Street as a hotel. It was called the Jackson Hotel back then, but the original structure didn't last long. It was destroyed in the Great Anoka Fire of 1884. But the people rebuilt it, piece by piece, and the Jackson Hotel stood again. Then it ran as a hotel for nearly a century, all the way up until the 1970s, when it finally shut down. And over the last 40 years or so, the building's been home to a handful of restaurants, before eventually becoming Billy's Bar and Grill, the bar and grill that people know today. And like most places with that kind of long, messy history, Billy's has stories. See, back during Prohibition, the hotel apparently had a bit of a reputation. It said that gangsters from the Twin Cities would make their way up the river, bringing alcohol, women, and trouble with them. They'd hole up here, away from the law, and the sounds of jazz and bootleg whiskey being poured filled the halls where travelers once slept. But the whispers don't stop there. Some say that the building didn't just host outlaws, and that it's been collecting ghosts ever since. In this modern day, thus, there's lots of ghost hunters that flock here. They've had productive EVP sessions, cold spots, and all kinds of strange experiences, too. On the third floor, according to one account I saw, there's supposedly a man that hangs out up there, and that at the base of the stairs leading up, two psychics actually refused to go any further because, according to them, whoever was up there didn't want them to. Well, alright then, whatever you say, people who can see things I can't. Apparently that same spirit was also insistent that he wasn't involved with, I quote, the murder, as if there was some kind of story behind that denial. And sure enough, connected to this event, there's an old rumor that a woman, supposedly from St. Paul, was taken in this hotel and quietly disposed of. No one exactly knows what happened, people just say that something happened, and some folks got rid of her. Visitors and investigators have also reported seeing shadows up here, walking around them when no one else was there. Mediums have also said they've felt people standing behind them, and actually seen people standing behind fellow ghost hunters, watching them silently from the dark, which, again, okay, you can see stuff I can't, so I guess I'm just gonna give you the benefit of the doubt. Downstairs, in the dining room, there's talk of a friendlier presence too, though, as a compliment to the prior scarier ghosts, a ghost that apparently likes to ask folks how their meal was, which honestly is more polite than the last waiter I had in Columbus, Ohio, although I suppose I was wearing a mustardy shade of yellow, so I can excuse that. That said, some diners claim their tables have been pounded on from underneath while they were eating, which sounds a little less polite, though I suppose it could just be someone's knee hitting the table, right? No, it probably has to be a ghost. And as for the most popular spirit at Billy's, it's the infamous red-headed woman. She's the one everybody talks about. They say she's nasty, mean even, and that she's been seen upstairs in what's now just storage and down in the basement too. One employee's story said they once tried to get into the storage room and they found the door wouldn't open, and therefore they went and got some help from their colleagues. And when they finally managed to get this door unstuck and budge it open, they discovered that beer cases had been stacked in front of the door from the inside, in front of the only entrance to the room. Further, this haunting is sometimes attributed to a strange slab of concrete that's raised above the floor in the basement, which some people claim that this red-headed woman might be buried underneath. Also, there's another story about this red-headed woman that's a little bit creepy, because frankly, whenever a ghost is mean to children, it rubs me the wrong way and makes me a little bit afraid. The story goes that one time a little girl came to Billy's on a tour with her grandmother, and partway through, the little girl started begging to leave. The grandmother asked why, and the little girl said, I quote, "The red-headed lady in the upstairs window looked mean." Even Billy's employees have had their own experiences, though. Some have come in early to find that coffee is already brewed, for instance, which, if true, is pretty convenient, but also a bit creepy and probably a fire hazard. Others say they've arrived to find that all the chairs in the building are stacked on top of tables. One manager shared that once she was even trying to shut off all the TVs one night before closing. One of the sets didn't have an on-off button, so she went to unplug it, as she always did, but just as she reached for the cord, the TV behind her flicked on by itself. She then turned, switched that one off, and when she looked back, the TV she was about to unplug was already powered down, and the wire, well, it was hanging down because it was already unplugged. And now, I thought I'd ask you good folks for some fan favorites, and see if you suggested anywhere that I didn't come across already. And lo and behold, you did! The first suggestion is from Sarah, and thanks for sharing this one, Sarah. It's Staples Mill Antique Store in Stillwater, Minnesota. Now, as for the history of this place, I found that this antique store's building dates back to the 1800s, around the time when Stillwater was a bustling river town known for its involvement in the lumber industry. Many of the buildings here were built to serve this bustling trade that flowed the St. Croix River, and this is one of them, hence its location in the historic downtown of Stillwater. Admittedly, beyond these details though, everything I found about this specific building is pretty vague, and all I could really find further is that this building was once part of Stillwater's commercial district. Today though, of course, this place is home to an antique store that sells vintage items, furniture, and collectibles, and due to this building's age, some make haunting claims about it. Now, again, let's be clear, given this is an obscure antique store, the accounts I found were on the vague side, much like the building's history. That said, I did find a couple of interesting stories. First off, there's a window that hovers above the front door of this shop that looks into its second floor, and I found some whispers on a local Facebook page that if you catch it just right on the right evening, you might see an older woman peering out of this antique store's window. And I also found a story of an item that was once kept in the store, a small, delicate porcelain doll. This doll, I saw one customer report, moved in front of her as she looked at it, despite nobody being close to it. She remarked as much to an employee who mentioned to her that she'd also noticed this phenomenon. My understanding, though, is that since this incident, the doll has been sold to one unlucky customer. So it's likely that the only haunting here is probably the old woman, whoever she is, that likes to stare out that upstairs window. Next up, we have a suggestion from Walter, the Pipestone Indian School. Also, don't come after Walter or me for the use of this name Indian here. This was the place's government-issued name and its historical name. This school was established in 1900 in Pipestone, Minnesota, a small town in southwestern Minnesota named for the nearby Pipestone quarries that may have been significant to the native people to make ceremonial pipes. They were built as part of the federal government's broader policy of forced assimilation of Native American tribes, and was built as part of the Native American boarding school system that existed across the USA. And this ages about as well as forgetting to flush the toilet, but the USA's goal behind this was to civilize Native American children by literally just removing them from their culture. Very bad stuff. Regardless, the curriculum here included agricultural work, carpentry, domestic skills, and some basic academics. Further, though, there was the assimilation portion of the school, too. Students were punished harshly for doing anything related to their heritage, whether it be practicing their traditions or speaking their native language. That said, this Disney villain bad guy strategy worked, and many of the descendants of those that attended these sorts of schools remain less connected to their native heritage to this day. And do you want to know the scariest part? These schools remained in operation into the 1950s, with this particular location closing in 1953, after people began to wake up to the harmful impacts of these schools, and Native communities began to demand control over their own education system. This being said, historically speaking, don't think for a second this was part of a larger positive recognition of Native rights. It was just something that the government was kind of forced into doing at the time. As for hauntings here, well, Walter himself shared some stories. He noted that there were stories of objects in this old school being moved around when nobody was there, and that wedged doors could find a way to slam on guides. I also found an interesting account from a supposed ex-employee, who said that on the second floor of this old school, after locking up from showing the first floor to a tour group, they actually saw a young man waving down at them. They of course would unlock the door again and run upstairs, already under their breath scolding the young man for not following the tour group and getting left behind. Of course, when she got up there, she heard no response, and when she looked around the room, she found that whoever had been up there waving to her had apparently already left. Walter also noted that in the area there's a pipeline being built, and this pipeline is downright churning up and digging on a lot of sacred ground. And some say that this work is only going to make this land more haunted. And I mean, just a quick Google of this monument shows off a handful of haunted places inside of it, including this interesting photo of what appears to be a Native American warrior with clay layered on his face, watching over whoever took this photo. Admittedly, some in the comments are claiming this is more a bad case of Photoshop blending gone wrong than a ghost, but I don't know how to shop a photo for the life of me, so I can't say this myself. Folks, thank you so much for stopping by this video, and good people of Minnesota, I hope you enjoyed this one too. Now, this isn't my last Minnesota video by any stretch. Soon, I'll be making you all a weird folklore video too, and maybe some other interesting videos, like a cryptid video if you want to see that. And if you want to get alerted to these when they come out, I encourage you to like this video, subscribe, turn on alerts, and comment. It'll never cost you a dime, and it's a quick way to say, hey YouTube, this guy's alright. Anyhow, this largely wraps up our season of spirits, so we're getting back to the weird videos that are my bread and butter here for a while. But don't fret, ghost videos will be back. Anyhow, whether you just found yourself in an old cave and saw some apparent gangsters smoking cigars by the bar, or if an old haunted doll waved at you while you were shopping for antiques, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.